Of any TV show, Game of Thrones arguably has the best rogue gallery. There's well over a dozen iconic villains in the series, and most TV shows are lucky to have just a few great villains. It's essentially what defines and makes Game of Thrones such an outstanding show because it's constantly driven by amazing conflict created by these villains. I'm going to try my best to rank all of them, which is pretty daunting considering the sheer amount and how many minor antagonists appear throughout the show. Number 40. Euron Greyjoy. This may seem overreactionary to put Euron on the bottom, but his execution is a complete tonal whiplash in that he's this cartoonish and over-the-top villain within a very grounded and serious show. I feel like David and Dan tried to create a character just as crazy and menacing as Ramsay, except they went a little too overboard with the humor to the point that it compromised his intimidation factor. Along with the way he acts in every scene where it's as if he's consistently ripping lines of cocaine. Then what makes this even worse is that David and Dan had a great blueprint in the books for a devious and menacing character, but I guess they decided to make their own character. So that side of Euron is in complete shambles, and almost every single event in the story in which he interacts with is extremely contrived. Him teleporting around Westeros with his fleet and somehow sneaking up on our heroes 3 separate times is insane. Him forgetting to turn off his aimbot as he snipes Rhaegal perfectly 3 times from far away was totally realistic. And then Cersei got mad at him for hacking, so he turned off his aimbot and stopped hitting his shots. And then there's the time where he casually swims ashore when Jaime arrives to King's Landing. Every single moment this character impacts the story is plagued with absolute bullshit that just makes me hate him even more. Then his whole ending is the biggest eye roll of the century, and you ask yourself why there's even a showdown between Jaime and Euron in the first place. Why did Euron and Theon never have another confrontation? What was the point of capturing Yara if the conflict resolution was pointless? How the hell did they build another massive iron fleet with virtually no trees in sight and in record times? If it's that easy, then why doesn't everyone have a gargantuan iron fleet? Why is Euron solely motivated by wanting to have sex with Cersei when he should realistically want to betray her? What's the point of this whole romance if it does nothing for either character? God, my head is going to explode from all these atrocious writing decisions, and there's so much to dissect for why Euron Greyjoy is the worst villain in the show. And it's honestly not even close for the others in my opinion. Number 39. The Sand Snakes. Now, I don't absolutely despise the Sand Snakes as much as other people, but given that there aren't that many bad villains in Game of Thrones, they essentially land in the bottom 3 of my ranking by default. They unfortunately come across as very shallow because they virtually have no character development or build up.
Oberyn tossed his spear at my feet and said, "Girl or boy, we fight."
Shut the fuck up!
They're pretty much just thrusted into the story quickly, and they're entangled with such a dumb conflict that they're destined to be unlikable. The banter and dialogue can definitely be better, but to a certain degree, they need to clash with one another to make their dynamics more interesting. However, since they barely have any development to make you care about their characteristics and dynamics, they end up coming across as dull and annoying antagonists. The only thing that is partially redeeming is the final scene between Tywin and Ellaria Sand. Genuinely a great scene in the later seasons, but yeah, when you zoom out and analyze the overall writing surrounding the Sand Snakes, it makes them even worse villains. Like the second Jaime leaves Dorne, that's when everyone's okay with overthrowing Doran, and when the Sand Snakes and Ellaria die, Dorne vanishes from the story. Number 38. The Slave Masters. Out of all the villains in Game of Thrones, these have to be the most mustache-twirly and superficial, which isn't a terrible thing, and they're not insultingly bad like some other villains, but given that they take up 3 seasons of Dany's time, I wish they could have been given more characterization or screen time. The broader antagonistic force is technically the Sons of the Harpy, which I think is a great and unnerving entity. However, I can't really classify them as a tangible villain character. There is this one lady, but David and Dan only use her as a recognizable face. So that essentially leaves these pompous shells of villains with the most basic motivations that you could literally care less about. They may as well be as basic as the Night King, except they have virtually no intrigue or anything interesting surrounding them. Then there's the whole train wreck of an ending in which they use a non-trained military force to attack Dany's army, which just comes across as David and Dan rushing this plotline to a conclusion, and it completely robs this 3-season arc of a satisfying ending.
madness and stupidity.
Number 37, the Lord of Bones. We're essentially entering the section of the list of minor antagonists, and we'll see important villains here and there. Also, you may think that by default, bigger villains like Euron should be over characters like this, but given that there are so many bad aspects that negatively impact Euron, I think that in turn anchors him down into the Shadow Realm, while some of these minor antagonists like the Lord of Bones don't have a laundry list of dog shit to deal with. With that said, the Lord of Bones is essentially a nothing of a character, and since he has a few scenes, I think he technically should be included. He at least has a cool design and makes the arsenal of wildlings more colorful, but the way he's handled in Hardhome was kind of a joke. Number 36, this dude. I genuinely had to look up this guy's name on IMDb from how much of a footnote he was in the show. He kind of just acts as a minor obstacle for Dany to crush to win over the Dothraki. And the way she overcomes him is probably one of the most stupid scenes in season 6. Like, everyone harps on Arya getting stabbed in the gut, but I see barely anyone talk about the fire spreading around the room as if there was gasoline on every square inch of every surface. Not to mention the fact that no one tries to run up to her despite having the ability to do so. Then, honestly, Khal Morrell doesn't really feel like a villain because he's pretty understanding and is fair in his treatment of Daenerys when his Blood Riders wanted to do other disgusting things to her. He may have acted in poor taste when first meeting her, but that's more of a reflection of their culture, and Dany not saying that she was Khal Drogo's wife for a while. Dany, if anything, comes off as more of the villain here, and I wish David and Dan leaned more heavily into this sentiment. Instead, D&D makes it to where Khal Morrell says some abhorrent things towards Dany that in turn makes the audience unquestionably hate him. So it essentially turns this into a generic girl boss moment when it should lean more into the audience being unsure or uneasy about whether or not Dany's actions are right. Like, she's going into this meeting with a predetermined goal of burning a dozen people alive for selfish gains. But yet, David and Dan treat this as a triumphant and empowering moment when it should be more sinister and evil. Number 35, Small John Umber. Rewatching Small John's introduction scene was pretty surprising because I thought it was a great character introduction. He's abrasive, rude, and he straight up disrespects Ramsay with an empowering aura of confidence. It's honestly commendable, and he just has this heavy charisma and weight behind every line he delivers, along with the scene efficiently establishing his character's motivation. It's just too bad that this is the only real scene he has in the show since he kind of dies in Bob. Harold Karstark is also here, which there's probably going to be a dozen minor background villains all over the place like Whack-A-Mole, so let's just pretend they don't exist to make this video easier. Number 34, Kraznys. I think Kraznys fulfills his role perfectly in the show. He just doesn't have a high ceiling in terms of a quality villain. He simply only sees women as objects, only cares about money, and is extremely disrespectful. Your typical deplorable human being. His reaction to the reveal that Dany speaks Valyrian was priceless, and Drogon setting him on fire was easily the best moment for Dany in season 3. Number 33, Septo Nella. Shame. Number 32, Lancel Lannister. So we're kind of back to a more prominent character, and one of the main reasons why I have him this low is because of how jarring his absence was. It's almost comical because Cersei literally punches and bullies Lancel out of the show, and then out of nowhere he comes back as a faith militant. That, and I think he's probably the blandest antagonist within the later seasons, and he has the line delivery of someone who sounds perpetually constipated.
The High Septon commands you. Are you sure you want to refuse him?
He's only here because David and Dan dusted off the shelf of characters and realized that they kind of forgot about Lancel, so they threw him into this villain role despite the audience probably assuming that Cersei killed him. Before this, I think Lancel was a fine character in season 2 who steadily grew from someone who was being manipulated, humiliated, and taken advantage of and slowly became more confident through the first 2 seasons. His dynamic with Tyrion was adorable, and it's too bad that there's nothing that comes close to any of this within seasons 5 and 6. At least his death was bombastic, but I don't really understand why he chased a random kid down an alleyway when he had direct orders to retrieve Cersei. Number 31, Ollie. In theory, Ollie should be a great and tragic protagonist turned antagonist, but David and Dan don't sustain him with proper character development. He kind of just fades into the background, and besides one singular scene of Jon training him and 1 minute of dialogue, he's relegated to being an extra who only receives reaction shots. I wouldn't be surprised if Ghost has more screen time. So the main confusing point in the writing here is that if your endpoint is ultimately going to be a heartbreaking betrayal, then I'd argue that building the relationship between Jon and Ollie would be crucial. More character interactions, more bonding, lighthearted scenes together, and fleshing out Ollie more seem like the most logical things to do from a writer's perspective. Or, I don't know, maybe make Ollie try to mask his hatred for the wildlings so that he can remain closer to Jon and gain his trust. The fact that Jon keeps Ollie so close is incredibly naive, given his blatant hatred for the wildlings, and it makes the relationship in season 5 puzzling. On the surface level, Ollie delivering the final blow to Jon is good, but there can be so much more depth to this moment that can make it significantly better. Besides that major downside, he has one great positive in that he's the one who kills Ygritte, which actually acts as revenge since Ygritte killed his father. It's obviously a great plot point, and I also think his death is solid as well, but I can't help but see wasted potential when viewing Ollie. Number 30, Qyburn. Speaking of wasted potential, Qyburn also easily fits this bill too. His only purpose in the show was to resurrect the mountain, and after that, David and Dan had no idea what to do with him. I think this was especially evidenced by his laughable death scene. He does bring scorpions into the equation, but he didn't actually invent them since they showed up in the recent Hot D trailer, and it doesn't even matter because they end up being useless. This character's depth could have been far greater given his aspirations for exploring dark scientific concepts. Like, what was the point of making him so fascinated by the White's undead hand if that surmounts to nothing? Imagine a reveal during the Bells in which Qyburn has been kidnapping and experimenting on poor people from Flea Bottom and turning them into undead slaves that they unleash into the city in the hopes of fighting Dany's army. Maybe then Dany would actually be motivated to burn down King's Landing and essentially cleanse the city of this rotten corruption and science. This would also be an interesting mirror to the Children of the Forest and them creating the Night King. I don't know, you could do anything with this character, and it's so disappointing that he's only a generic Cersei stan with no kind of personal motivations. Number 29, Meryn Trant. This is by no means a bad villain, and it's just your standard minor antagonist. I think he fulfills this role just fine and doesn't need any more scenes. He makes a perfect companion piece antagonist to Joffrey as he carries out his terrible commands, essentially giving the character an excuse to do heinous activities while acting like he's not at fault given it's what the king commands. This plays into one of my favorite themes that Jaime constantly grapples with, of ignoring your king for the betterment of the realm. That, and I think he has a perfect ending and Arya absolutely decimating him. Number 28, Orell. It always felt kind of weird that Orell was the only person who picked up on Jon Snow lying because, at least to the viewer, it's made pretty obvious.
Which others?
Eastwatch by the sea and the Shadow Tower.
And since this is the case, it kind of turns Orell into an annoying the boy who cried wolf type character. It is nice that there is some opposition for Jon in easily joining the wildlings, but Orell as a character never really interested me. That and how dare he come in between the great love relationship of Jon and Ygritte. Number 27, the Waif. The Waif is kind of like the Night King in that she's a superficially intriguing villain, but at no point do we ever learn anything about her. This in turn makes it to where her motivations aren't really established, and she just hates Arya for reasons. Like, is she envious? Jealous? Does she resent her for lying or having special treatment? Is she a sadist for enjoying torturing Arya so much? Or is the Waif's existence to just challenge Arya to become a faceless assassin? There's no closure in the end that reveals any of these motivations, and because of this, she feels more like an artificial plot device instead of a character. In the books, she has more personality, and she doesn't spontaneously hate Arya for no reason. While in the show, she kind of just feels like a drill sergeant from the military. And I'm not even going into the fact of how insanely contrived the whole chase scene between them was. Number 26, Pyat Pree. As a device within the story, I think Pyat Pree is intriguing and adds some cool texture to Qarth, but I don't think he has enough screen time to really justify a high placement. He's basically carried by his mystique, and the fact that he's the reason Dany gets this incredible scene of being reunited with Khal Drogo and the great foreshadowing. Also, it feels kind of weird that David and Dan introduced this plot thread of the Warlock sending assassins after Dany, but that's immediately dropped. If Pyatt had more characterization and David and Dan didn't immediately drop the whole magic angle of the show, then I think this would be a much better villain. Number 25, Styr. Styr is just a very solid brief villain who immediately cements himself as a devious demon, who is a relentless and ruthless killer. Every scene essentially elevates Styr's craziness, and this is all to build such a climactic showdown between him and Jon, because by this point, the hatred the audience has for him is so well established that it makes the fight have riveting stakes. That and the actor portraying him seems to be having the time of his life, and one of my favorite moments was the joy he has when he first sees Jon, an actual challenge. Number 24, Xaro Xhoan Daxos. I think the twist for this character is his primary draw and the overall lesson it teaches Dany, because besides that, I think Xaro is mostly a vanilla villain, especially in comparison to so many of the other colorful antagonists. This isn't to say that he's a bad character, and his friendly demeanor is perfectly orchestrated to mask his sinister intentions. He's the classic example of a figure wanting more power and doing anything to get there. Number 23, Craster. For a second, I came close to removing Craster from this list because he kind of operates as a character that aids our protagonists. However, that would be completely overlooking the fact of him personally supplying White Walkers to the Night King's ranks for decades. In a macro sense, Craster of any villain probably hurts the realm the most because of these actions. Then besides that, his fundamental character is just perfect for this world. I never really thought about this, but he's kind of like the wildling version of Walder Frey. He's gross, grimy, greedy, gouty, gluttonous, and he constantly exudes this grotesque aura. The irony of our heroes having to treat a character like this, like a friend, is delicious. Number 22, Miri. Out of all the villains in the show, I think Miri is the most overlooked, and I actually find her to be very compelling and realistic. From our perspective for Miri's introduction, we think what Dany is doing is a great act of kindness, in that she's saving these people from becoming enslaved. But in reality, this act is completely distorted because she's part of the group that's causing all of this pain and misery. Because of this oversight, Dany lets a wolf into her inner circle, and despite what everyone says, Drogo didn't really die from an infection. He was poisoned by Miri, and Dany's ignorance, not seeing past her own glorious actions, blinded herself to the fact that Miri fundamentally hated the Dothraki. I think Miri is kind of a brilliant villain who is devised to solely teach Dany this lesson of trying to predict and understand people's motivations. Miri, despite not having a lot of complexity, intrigue, or depth, is still able to have a strong and profound impact on the story. Number 21, Janos Slynt. In retrospect, I admire Janos more than when I originally watched the show. He perfectly plays into the slimy and snake-like character that just makes you despise him. He's such a kiss-ass, and seeing him instantly attach himself to Alliser Thorne like a leech is great. He has this funny beta relationship with Sir Alliser, in which he acts all confidently, but you know he packs no bite, and only gains this confidence because he's attached to Sir Alliser. Then, the one moment he oversteps and firmly disobeys Jon, he's left for dead, and doesn't realize the ramifications of his actions. It's kind of like a mirror actually to Tyrion banishing him for betraying Ned, but here, this disobedience means his death. Janos doesn't learn from his corrupted past and only doubles down. Then his last moments act as the thesis for his character, in which his true self is revealed, where he's a scared little boy pretending to be big and important. And this also acts as a great scene to really break in Jon Snow as a leader. Number 20, Locke. Locke doesn't really have a lot of character development, and is mostly carried by how wicked and evil he is. At the end of the day, he's essentially just one of Roose Bolton's top men, so it's kind of impressive how he's able to secure himself at the halfway point on my list. That ends, I think Noah Taylor does a great job of bringing in an air of unhingedness to the character, along with Locke being able to show some restraint and intellect by going undercover, which makes him even more intriguing. Then there's obviously the moment of him casually taking Jaime's hand that single-handedly elevates his character's impact. Number 19, Randall Tarley. By season 6, David and Dan drastically slowed down on introducing new characters, so having a new and fresh character that adds a juicy dynamic with a pre-existing one was a great and needed addition. His relationship with Samuel is absolutely gutting, and the entire dynamic of a father who hates their son is always tragic. That and his voice carries so much weight and gravitas that it increases his menacing factor significantly. It's too bad that outside of this one dinner scene, the character doesn't really have much else to do and he's quickly killed in season 7. Which makes sense, but Dickon also wanting to kill himself was such a weird writing choice that only feels like David and Dan were trying to force some artificial drama. Number 18, Miranda. Before rewatching Miranda's scenes, I thought she had more screen time than what she did, because she has a few brief appearances in seasons 3 and 4, and doesn't really come to life until season 5 when Sansa shows up. Sansa's introduction into the Ramsay and Miranda dynamic adds a lot of conflict. It makes the inner turmoil for Miranda more interesting, and thus makes her even scarier. She adds this level of terror towards Sansa where she pretends to be friendly, while also planting this notion of how evil Ramsay can be.
And there was Violet, but she got pregnant, and well, that was boring.
Anyone else would keep this a secret, but Miranda wants Sansa to be scared. In general, Miranda's relationship with Ramsay is so captivating because it's two equally insane people finding love, like a psychotic version of Bonnie and Clyde. They perfectly play off of each other, and I wish we got more crazy scenes between them. Number 17, Balon Greyjoy. Balon and Rando are pretty similar, and the main difference is that I think the dynamic between Theon and Balon has more depth. Their relationship single-handedly makes Balon a great character, and his emotional manipulation of Theon is amazing to watch unfold. We witness in real time how Theon goes from a protagonist to a full-on antagonist. Balon straight up gives Theon an identity crisis, and this kind of hateful father is just so interesting. That and the whole Iron Island culture adds a nice contrast to the other kingdoms of Westeros. The main downside for Balon is that he only has 4 scenes, and one of them is just his quick death. If he had more scenes, then I could see myself putting him higher, and it feels weird narratively how he dies right before Theon gets back to the Iron Islands. Like having one more scene between them where Theon overcomes his father and no longer cares about his approval would have been great, but Balon unceremoniously dies after not being in the show for almost 3 seasons. Number 16, Grand Maester Pycelle. I initially wasn't going to include Pycelle on this list, but he's technically a minor antagonist for almost every main character in the show. By far, Pycelle's biggest strength is the nuance of his character. There are several moments in the show that allude to Pycelle faking his fragility to garner sympathy, and or to mask his competence in the eyes of other dangerous characters. He's like the chameleon of Game of Thrones who tries to blend in, but he still has great influence due to his long duration in the capital and the people he has access to. There is a deleted scene that reveals this, but I think it was a good decision to leave this aspect of his character as a fine detail. I also find most of Pycelle's scenes to be funny, whether he's being a blatant hypocrite, in the irony of his vast education and believing in dumb rhetorics, or him just being a bumbling and silly fool. I think he does stagnate a bit towards the later seasons, but at least he has a perfect and cathartic death scene. Number 15, Gregor Clegane the Mountain. I feel like a lot of people would put the Mountain higher, but he's literally just a force used by other actual villain characters. He's so much of a non-character that he's been recast 3 times. But this isn't to say that he's a bad antagonist by any means. His lethality and danger he imposes on the different characters is immense. He's a mammoth of a fighter, and this in turn makes him a captivating figure to watch because overcoming him is almost impossible. Which, at the end of the day, this is one of the most important aspects for a villain and how hard of an obstacle they are for the protagonists. And that's something this character nails. His fight with Oberyn easily uplifts him, and is one of the biggest driving conflicts in the show, creating this inescapable feeling of dread for Tyrion. Number 14, Carl Tanner. Besides this one shot of the Night King, Carl Tanner has the most iconic villain shot of him drinking wine from Jeor Mormont's skull. George. Also, looking back at his character, he's really not that special and isn't even set up before season 3. But Burn Gorman brings such a devilish performance that it easily elevates this villain into iconic status. He's the embodiment of the dark and grimy side of the Night's Watch, and this kind of motif has been a through line for the first 3 seasons. So because of that, I'm kind of okay with this character not being set up beforehand. He's essentially an inevitable villain who was pushed too far by Craster and the circumstances of the story. The showdown he has with Jon was pretty epic, and it was probably the most exciting fight scene at that point in the show. Number 13. Lysa Arryn. Lysa Arryn is kind of like a protagonist, but at the same time, she's causing so much harm to the overarching story to the point that she's indirectly a villain. She is being manipulated by Littlefinger, but even a lot of her scenes where he's not around, she's still being a B-word. Sorry, YouTube thinks that's a big no-no word. From her denying assistance to the North in their war against the Lannisters, her wanting to kill Tyrion just because she wants to, and her becoming so jealous of Sansa that she almost kills her, displays her as being a pretty unsettling villain. The entire aura of her mental unwellness, and how a character like this has so much power, I think is inherently engrossing. Then she also has one of the best villain deaths, so that definitely helps. Number 12. The High Sparrow. On one hand, I like the smart manipulation that this character embodies, and how he masks his intentions with a friendly and warm demeanor, while deep down, his intentions are more sinister. Along with the fact that he totes equal representation of justice, and then does nothing but hunt down royalty for relatively minor crimes, instead of going after flat-out murderers or rapists. Then, on the other hand, I find almost all of High Sparrow's scenes to be entrenched in a mundane atmosphere that isn't very entertaining. Especially in comparison to the other main villains, whose scenes are constantly driven by great conflicts and more interesting plots. There are some scenes here that are pretty engaging, like his talk with Olenna.
The gods demand justice.
How do they communicate their demands? By raven or horse?
Which was a fun sparring match akin to her talk with Tywin, but the rest normally take place in this closet of a set, and are normally not riveting. The Sept explosion may be a major highlight superficially, but the lack of ramifications for there being no common folk uprising completely undercuts the legacy of what the High Sparrow stood for. So, I really only like the High Sparrow as a character, and not necessarily the story that surrounds him. That, and he kind of has the advantage of having numerous scenes in comparison to others. Number 11. Roose Bolton. I think the best aspect of any kind of franchise is having morally gray or evil characters on the supposed good side of the narrative. It makes your story feel less black and white, and creates a lot more nuance in terms of characters. Having surprise villains like Roose Bolton, I think is an example of excellent writing, because he isn't flat out good. He's driven by personal motivations and doesn't hesitate to betray Robb for more power. Roose Bolton in the context of the show is mostly overshadowed by Ramsay, but I think Roose is still really interesting in how observant, smart, and calculating he is as a character, which is directly contrasted by Ramsay, and because of this, that creates some fun debates between them. If Roose Bolton had more scenes that utilized him in a more villainy way, then I'd probably put him higher. Like, I wish we witnessed a scene like the story he told Ramsay about his mother, because it was very diabolical.
Apparently they'd married without my knowledge or consent, so I had him hanged, and I took her beneath the tree where he was swaying. She fought me the whole time. She was lucky I didn't hang her too.
But after the Red Wedding, it feels like he dies down a bit and goes into retirement. Which is fine narratively, I just prefer villains that are more consistently impacting the story. Number 10. Walder Frey. I feel like it's kind of unhealthy how much I love Walder Frey. The pure, disgusting, dirty, and grubby nature of the character is brought to life perfectly by David Bradley. He's just so compelling at being absolute scum that you can't help but love his rendition of the character, and I think his voice adds a lot to the villain. He's also directly entangled with the best scene of the show, and he absolutely kills the scene by showing pure joy and excitement in the face of utter tragedy. The moment of him not caring about his wife is a perfect cherry on top, and this scene alone cements him as being a legendary villain. Like, he doesn't need a lot of character development. Any kind of character building just oozes out of him effortlessly through the acting and details of how he portrays himself. Overall, I think he's perfectly utilized, and is in just the right amount of scenes. Number 9. Mance Rayder. Mance was another character I didn't really consider as a villain because he truly is a protagonist. But what makes him so compelling as a villain is the way in which he wants to achieve his goal. This is a fundamental difference between him and Jon, because Jon wants some kind of unrealistic peaceful solution, while Mance knows that's impossible and is willing to force his way through Castle Black, thus causing violence and death for the greater good. This dichotomy between Mance and Jon makes each of their dialogue scenes captivating to watch, and Mance's stubbornness also riles up Jon as well. Mance is like the embodiment of the free folk. Proud, unshackled, obstinate, and all of these characteristics make him a fun character to watch. Also, I think the reveal of his character where he comes off as giving Jon a chance, is accepting, and is relatively open-minded and witty, makes his core character a convention break of sorts where you expect an insanely ruthless and evil villain. Instead, Mance's character establishes a story motif of how the free folk are just normal people who want a chance at living. Because of this, Mance is probably the most agreed with villain, and his failure is kind of a tragedy. Number 8. Viserys Targaryen. What a deliciously fun character that you can't help but love. He's so deluded mentally as he never is aware of how things realistically work in the world. Like expecting the Dothraki to be 100% subservient instantly after handing over Daenerys. He's the definition of an entitled brat who doesn't understand how the world works. So seeing him get a brutal reality check during his stay with the Dothraki was brilliant. That and it allows Dany to begin her arc in which she overcomes his toxic grasp, which it's very toxic. And the line of dialogue where he let 1,000 Dothraki rape her and their horses for a chance at the Iron Throne was gutting. His final scene where he's bumbling around like a maniac grips your heart with suspense, and the release of him getting killed by getting his crown was a perfect death. I will never come up with something that clever in my life. Number 7. Alliser Thorne. I'm probably the one person who would put Sir Alliser this high on a villain ranking list. I just absolutely adore the man because he has so much to offer. Whether that's his pure grit and experience as he's exuding captivating horror stories, his conflicting relationship with Jon that constantly twists a knife into his psyche and imbues this whole plotline with great conundrums, his unwavering loyalty to the Night's Watch, and his pure badassery when he's called on to defend it, and he even has some outstanding moments of levity. Like that singular scene of him talking to Jon on top of the wall before the battle was one of my favorite dialogue scenes in season 4. Sir Alliser is simply the most based villain in the show, and he may have a dumb plotline where he admits to killing Jon and acts like there'll be no opposition, but his core character wasn't ruined. He at least has a deeply somber death scene where he thinks he failed his one duty in life. Like, it's kind of crazy honestly how much he sympathized with this villain despite him killing the primary protagonist in the show. That alone is a massive achievement and means he's a rock solid and fully realized character. Number 6. The Night King. I can see why people would probably say the Night King is one of the best villains in the show, but I'd personally prefer the more character-adjacent villains. Even putting him at number 6 seems kind of high to me, but I can't ignore his fundamental impact on the show. The Night King is the embodiment of the threat that's coming for everyone. It's what the show is building towards, and is a massive motivator and a constant ticking clock for everyone to get their shit together. It also surprises me that the Night King was actually created by David and Dan, which was an outstanding idea, but at the same time, I think their execution was complete rubbish. They simultaneously set up all these artificial symbols that lead to nothing.
I'm not sure exactly what they signify, but spiral patterns are important in a lot of different cultures in our world, and it makes sense that they would be in this world as well.
And one of the biggest aspects about the Night King that feels wrong in season 8 is that he isn't the final villain. The whole undead threat was the first scene in the show and has been a constant through line. So it's just crazy to me that narratively, this entire conflict is resolved in one episode and done before Cersei's resolution. Obviously that whole episode has a lot of other problems, but I still think the Night King's overall reputation wasn't damaged enough to send him into the Shadow Realm. Number 5. Petyr Baelish. The next 5 villains can honestly be shuffled into any order because they're all 10 out of 10 villains. Littlefinger embodies my favorite aspects of the show, which are scheming and conspiracy. These are the core foundations of Game of Thrones, and Littlefinger in the first 4 seasons has some of the most incredible scenes in television, period. Whether that be groundbreaking betrayals or some of the most intriguing and captivating dialogue scenes to be put to screen. Every dialogue interaction with Varys is outstanding, and his Chaos is a Ladder monologue is easily the best villain monologue in the show. Littlefinger is also just an enigma of a character, and trying to play the game of figuring out his motivations is incredibly engaging. There's easily a laundry list of positives I can keep diving into, but it's unfortunate that David and Dan don't sustain this greatness through seasons 5, 6, and 7. There's such a massive drop-off for this character's intellect, and most of his scheming becomes a convoluted mess. Then his ending is flat out depressing for how much of a brain-dead character he becomes. But at least his first 4 seasons were absolutely amazing. Number 4. Cersei Lannister. Unlike Littlefinger, I think David and Dan were able to maintain a decent quality baseline for Cersei in the later seasons. There are definitely flaws surrounding her character, but her core being doesn't feel that compromised. But besides the annoying baggage of the later seasons, Cersei's constant humanity that's highlighted by her love for her children makes her an endearing character. She's the most compelling and understandable villain because of this, and most of the time, we can sympathize with the insane shit she does. Also, almost all of her scenes are orchestrated around personal relationships, so the vast majority of her screen time is imbued with raw emotional conflict, especially in the earlier seasons with Tyrion where their dialogue is some of the best in the show. Cersei is a constant presence and is like a small dagger that twists into the sides of almost every character. She's consistently great and has some of the most raw scenes in the show. Number 3. Ramsay Bolton. We all know why this lovable freak is here. His complete batshit insane mentality and utter unpredictability makes him the most terrifying villain in Game of Thrones. You never know if he's going to be nice to you, or flat out decide to cut off your fingers. This level of unhingedness creates an aura of petrification that freezes every character in fear. This is obviously carried by Iwan Rihan delivering a deliciously insane performance, and he breathes a quality of manic energy into the character. Through this being his easily excitable nature, or him swinging through emotions like a boomerang. He has this infectious ferocity that makes every scene very captivating to watch. This is essentially why Season 6 was still regarded as a good season, because his presence alone carried that season. He single-handedly drove the conflict of an entire battle. When he died, the drop-off of villain quality was extremely staggering. Number 2. Joffrey Baratheon. Joffrey and Ramsay are hotly debated as to who's crazier, and to me, I always felt like Joffrey was nowhere near as insane as Ramsay. Joffrey is more of a spoiled rich kid who discovers his sadistic tendencies. He can still put on that mask and operate as a normal human being, but there's always that devious pull of wanting to cause pain to others, which seeing this gradual progression be actualized alongside his progression of power is outstanding. It slowly turns him into a more and more devilish villain, and it all explodes at the end of Baelor. This singular moment that's driven by Joffrey sells the entire show and establishes how real the threat of villains are in this world. From this point on, Joffrey is fully unleashed, and through each consecutive scene, he keeps reminding the audience how great of a villain he is. He's consistently important throughout the first 4 seasons, and his death alone ignites the plot of King's Landing as if the Blackwater just exploded. Number 1. Tywin Lannister. This shouldn't be a surprise, given that I made an entire video about why he's the best villain in the show. But to condense that down, he simultaneously has a massive impact. Every scene he's in directly instills riveting conflict into each character. His point of view feels justified, as a father desperately trying to secure his house's legacy. And Charles Dance commands a metric fuckton of screen presence, whether that's through his restrained and powerful gestures or his deep and methodical voice. Every nanosecond this character is on screen is a feast for the audience. Tywin can simply be fishing and the scene would be S tier. He single-handedly makes the King's Landing plot through seasons 3 and 4 a masterpiece, while also being responsible for other major events like the Red Wedding. It's purely head-spinning how much this character does in the show, while also still having so many down-to-earth and magnificent dialogue scenes. Every talk with Tyrion is wholly engaging, and his death scene in particular has some methodical wordplay. I'm a proud Tywin stan, and would gladly die on the hill that he's the best villain in Game of Thrones. Thank you for watching, and I'm sorry if this went a little too long. I feel like it wouldn't be a genuine list if I didn't touch on every villain in the show, big and small. Given that revenue for YouTube is a complete clusterfuck, in that you can either get spontaneously demonetized for months, get harassed by hackers who can steal everything, or Warner Bros deciding that fair use doesn't mean anything anymore, and starts copyright claiming your big video essays that you spent weeks on, and reject any of your disputes. So if you sympathize with this struggle, then I'd be extremely grateful if you wanted to support this channel on Patreon. I try to offer some rewards like a voting category for some videos, or even thanking you audibly on the end screen. I wish I could just be sustained from ad revenue alone, but it's so easily compromised. And when you have to pay rent and other bills, it gets a little scary sometimes. Also, thank you immensely to Logan Farmer, my top patron, who is single-handedly carrying me.